Well, welcome everyone. This is the first panel after lunch, so hopefully you've had coffee and are ready for an exciting conversation. My name is Joe Glauber. I'm a senior research fellow at the International Food Policy Research Institute, actually emeritus these days, which is Latin for unpaid. But I'm also a non-resident senior advisor here at CSIS with the Global Food and Water Security Team, which has been a very fun group to work with. We've been working a lot on Ukraine and other things going on in the world. So if you don't know it, you're not in the panel on China. You're on the panel called The Fruits of an Integrated North American Market. Let me first give you a little bit of idea of some of the logistics. It's a 60-minute panel. We're gonna let the panelists each come up and give a short presentation, and then, or actually, yeah, I guess they can, for that, they might as well come up here. And then we're gonna take, we'll have a moderated discussion with me, and then we're gonna take some questions from the audience. So if you have a question, and this may be you may know this drill from the morning, but scan the QR code, and then that will allow you to plug in the question. If you're online, use the Q&A function on the event page to submit your questions. And we are live streaming this, and so it will be available after the conclusion of the event. Okay, so a little brief introduction just I've been involved with North American ag issues for a long, long time. I had some involvement with the US-Canada Free Trade Agreement, some of the analyses that went into those negotiations, then participated in the North American Free Trade Agreement, and then also negotiations, then also on the analysis that USDA put out. I was with the Department of Agriculture at the time. We put out analyses of that. So this is something I've followed for a long, long time. And I think it's, it's one of the real success stories that we like to point to, just in the sense of if you just look at the trade among the North American partners, that is increased almost 5 times since 1995. I mean, just phenomenal growth, annual growth rate of around 6.7%. And that is higher than overall growth. World trade obviously has increased a lot over that period as well. But that is at least 1.5 percentage points higher in the annual growth rate, which really means something. I mean, this has really been for a variety of commodities. I think we'll hear people, some of our panelists talking about the fruit and vegetable industry, how important that's been. The fact that we now are able to get year-round things like blueberries and strawberries and raspberries and green peppers and asparagus and all sorts of things in grocery stores. And you think about 30 years ago, and it's not that long ago that the stuff we would find in grocery stores during the winter months in particular was pretty slim. And I think that really actually obviously has ramifications for nutrition and a whole host of other things. You look at a livestock market that's very well integrated, where an animal may cross the border several times, maybe not in a live form, but we do import, US imports a lot of feeder pigs from Canada, calves from Mexico and Canada. They get fed, finished here, may get slaughtered back in Mexico or Canada, and then meat being processed and sold globally. So our panel is going to talk about the growth of the North American agricultural sector and how that's really blossomed and flourished under the USMCA, or the NAFTA, as I'm more wont to call it. I'm really happy we're really have a really good panel. I'm going to start with Juan Cortina Gallardo, who is online with us today. Unfortunately couldn't be here, but he's currently the vice president, of Mexico's Business Coordinating Council and the former president of Mexico's National Agricultural Council. Why don't we start, Juan, with your opening remarks? Okay. let me move on to Candace Laing.
Oh, he's there.
Yeah, there you are.
Yeah.
Juan, if you could give us a few remarks.
Yes,
Start
of
us
course.
off.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and I wanted to thank CSIS for this event. I think it's extremely timely with what's happening around the world and between the US and Mexico, that we have this full security sort of summit between the three countries, which I think it's, again, very timely. I think we need to realize that we're in a changing world, and we've had already 30 years of integration between our three countries, Canada, the US, and Mexico. And we need to realize that we have a very complex and complementary supply lines that have been built over the last 30 years. And I think that's a real testament on how hard and far our three countries have progressed in this sense. As I was saying, I think it's important to note that the agriculture sector is one of the best examples, I think, of free trade success under USMCA along all of the different sectors of our economy. USMCA has obviously strengthened, very importantly, the agricultural resilience by fostering the economic and leveraging complementary production capabilities between the three countries in the region. As you all know, we're having a lot of global challenges such as climate change, geopolitical tensions, labor shortages, and supply chain disruptions, as what happened with the pandemic. And I think this agreement has been a testament on how we can have predictable trade flows and a predictable regulatory environment and alignment between the three countries. I think the other important point that I wanted to make is that North America collectively has a food self-sufficiency ratio of close to 113%. I don't think there's another region in the world where this is a reality. And I think that's something that we need to be cognizant about. We need to be very careful to protect it. And I think moving forward, again, with what's going on around the world and how volatile this has become, food security and ensuring that it continues for our three countries is extremely, extremely important. I think, we need to take into account that we need to preserve and strengthen what we have moving forward. For example, in having some statistics, in 2024, Mexico provided 23% of all U.S. agricultural imports, and Canada provided 19%. But if we zoom in terms of what we import and we export, we see that, for example, Mexico imports 99% of its corn from the U.S. We import 78% of all soy that we need, and close to 70% of all wheat. On the same token, on the other side, fruits and vegetables, the imports that the U.S. makes those products year-round, for them to be in fresh produce every month of the year, you're talking about 85% comes from Mexico. That complementary nature of our geography, our climate, is something that's very important, and I think that's something we need to underline moving forward. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks so much. Next, we have Candace Laing, who's President and CEO of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. Candace was born and raised in Saskatchewan, and prior to going to the Chamber of Commerce, she's had experience with Nutrien and other input dealers, which is, I don't know this will come up in your talk, but obviously fertilizer obviously is another product that's of utmost importance to U.S. producers and others.
Well, it will now, Joseph. Fertilizer will be in my talk. Thank you for that. I want to start by just saying the only reason I'm here today is because of our trade. And yes, I head up the Chamber of Commerce in Canada today, and I spent before that more than a decade of my career with Nutrien, which is the world's largest provider of crop inputs, fertilizer, and the largest agricultural retailer globally. And yet my story in agriculture goes much, much deeper than that. Like Juan, I'm going to take you back 30 years. And for some of you, I'm about to date you, because it was more than just over 30 years ago that we had the huge baseball strike. Who remembers the big baseball strike? I know you're dating yourselves, like I'm outing you here, so. But it was significant. But it was significant for me in a way that links very clearly for me to the topic we are here to talk about today. And thank you, Juan, for your opening comments and just reassurance of how important our trade is. So I did end up in business with Nutrien and the Chamber of Commerce. But initially it was a big deal for me to leave my family's farm. But that baseball strike had a pivotal moment in my decision to go off farm and head to business school. And at which point my dad said, well, good, you can do the books then for the farm. And I said, sure. So if you go off farm, you have to be very useful. That's ingrained in me. But I was doing my duties on the farm, which at that time were getting ready for the next crop, and I had to do the manual labor of cleaning out our grain bins really well to put the next year's crop in. But I didn't have to clean 2 of those big grain bins. And I'm like, yes, skip those ones. But my dad's like, well, that's our mustard. And I'm like, oh, okay, like why is the mustard still here? Why can't we move it? Because of the baseball strike. Because all those hot dogs weren't being eaten that didn't need our mustard, which usually that was the trade flow. And at that moment, I'm like, this is so interesting and so fascinating how everything is so connected. And so commerce, which is a very big passion for many of us, became my focus. And in the 30 years that it has been since, we have done a couple things. We've expanded those trade flows, and we have advanced, I don't want to step over this, the agricultural practices all over our continent, which allows us to be so complementary as well. Because at that time, mustard was kind of a big deal, because I grew up, we only grew wheat, germ, and barley, just the grains. And now Canada is known in row cropping for its grains, its oil seeds, and then we got rid of summer fallow and put nitrogen-fixing pulses like lentils, peas, chickpeas. And so you have that continuous rotational cropping. And so I don't want to step over that point, because I think as we talk about trade, underpinning that is just how across our continent, the agriculture, given different weather patterns and all of that, has advanced with our ag tech. We just complement each other so well, and trade helps us capitalize on that. But I want to talk a little bit about the value chain and get to fertilizer, because often, and even when I was with Nutrien working more globally on food and ag policy, it's very easy to kind of get heavy in the value chain on the consumer side. Sorry, that's on my left, that's what I'm going to say. But what about the other side of the value chain? And people are like, yeah, we've gotten right back up that whole farm to fork piece. And I'm like, well, good, you've made it to the grower. You've made it halfway, congratulations. You've got to, when we think about all of this, look at the upstream and the input side of the entire food and ag value chain, because it's so significant. And that's where we do get into critical things like fertilizer. So, and some people, they ask me like, well, you're the potash girl, so talk about potash. And it's incredibly significant because it's, you have fertilizer, you have NPK. Nitrogen, we can process. We fix, thanks to the Haber-Bosch process, it's a chemical process, we can fix nitrogen out of the air, basically. When it comes to phosphate and potash, those are deposits from the evaporation of ancient seaways. And thank goodness the US has quite a bit of phosphate that benefits the rest of us. But when it comes to potash, there are very, very limited deposits that are of the scale that Saskatchewan does have in Canada. There's only one in the world that comes close to that type of a deposit, and it happens to be with the Russians and Belarusians. So when you're the US and you look at a critical crop input that growers need. Now, the numbers vary, but it's between 80 to 90% of what the US needs with potash comes from Saskatchewan. And it's a critical input. Without it, people say the economics of a Big Mac, which there are 500 million of sold in this country a year, don't even make sense, because you can't support the corn, the soy, all the wheat, all of that. So it is a big deal, and you think, okay, if something happens and our trade breaks down, you just put up more mines in the US or source more from the Russians and Belarusians. But even if you source more from the Russians and Belarusians, it's costly to get it over here, and it takes time and a lot of money because the infrastructure to get it to the Midwest does not exist today. And so the reserves that are in the US as well are far more light compared to the rich reserves that rest in Saskatchewan. So I could go into many other examples. Fertilizer, of course, is in my wheelhouse, and that's a huge one. But there's so much back and forth advantage. We provide seed potatoes out of Canada because the seed coming from a colder climate protects disease from getting like this. We always hear, I think today, too much about self-sufficiency. But there are these really, if you get self-sufficient in any of our regions, there's impacts and consequences to that that are beyond economic. Some of this is just in the security of the supply and managing in really good and natural ways, fighting disease in our food supply. So I'll maybe wrap it up there, but obviously to echo Juan, and I'm sure you'll hear from Anne, just how well our agreement serves us and how deeply rooted that's a good pun. It is in agriculture, unintentional. But I think my ask would be, when we're talking about our trade agreement and agriculture, that we're cognizant, all of us advocate for the full scope of the value chain. And we don't over-index on consumers, and that we also factor into this the voice of our growers and producers and the needs and what their needs are on the input side. Because if extra costs get added to that, I mean, it does start to fall apart quite quickly. And because, back to Juan's point, this has been 30 years in the making, the value destruction, because we've relied on the certainty of long-term agreements that, and we'll get into this on the panel, but the efficiencies that have been built in the supply chains is something I want to talk more about on the panel, because unwinding that is a path to not a great place. So with that, I will hand it back over to our moderator, Joseph. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks so much. Our last panelist is Anne McKini, who's with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, where she's the Vice President for the Americas. Anne oversees business advocacy and policy-oriented programs to promote trade and investment. Anne's had extensive experience with the Department of Commerce, if I'm not mistaken. Anne, please.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Joe. And I'd also like to thank the Americas program at CSIS for the invitation to be here today. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce has had a longstanding commitment to strengthening our economic ties in North America. And it's really great to be here with Candace and Juan. We greatly value our partnership with the Canadian Chamber of Commerce and with Mexico's Business Coordinating Council. Our three organizations were heavily engaged and invested in the process leading up to the entry into force of USMCA. We championed state-of-the-art provisions. We pushed back against the frequent threats to withdraw from the old NAFTA, and insisted really on retaining a trilateral agreement to the benefit of the region and our three countries. About 5 years ago, when USMCA entered into force in July of 2020, our three organizations issued a joint statement. And I thought it was interesting, it's a timely moment to look back at that joint statement from 5 years ago, because there's a number of messages that I think are very relevant to today. And one of the underlying messages was that our three countries are members of the same team. We championed the agreement and also underscored the work that needed to be fully implement its provisions. Top among the benefits were clear and stable rules of the road. USMCA provided job creators, farmers, manufacturers, service providers, input providers with the certainty that they need to invest, hire, and grow and contribute to our shared prosperity. Strengthening the North American partnership continues to be a priority today for the U.S. business community. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce represents companies of all sizes and across all sectors of the economy. Our members range from the small businesses and local chambers that line Main Street to global corporations that operate around the world, and industry associations as well. And that's why the Chamber is focused on advancing a pro-growth agenda, and trade is chief among the priorities, along with taxes and regulations, getting our public policies right to promote economic growth. And trade is so important, as many of you know, because here in the United States, it generates 40 million jobs that depend on our trade with partners around the world. These jobs also pay higher rates of compensation than jobs in other sectors. And nearly half of U.S. manufacturing output is exported to customers overseas. At the Chamber, we advocate for trade policies that will help make the United States the best place in the world to invest, build, hire, and innovate, while also allowing U.S. companies of all sizes and sectors to sell their goods and services in international markets. And as this audience knows well, agriculture is a cornerstone of the U.S. economy. Agriculture and food industries support more than 34 million jobs, and the sector's influence extends beyond farms to include food services, manufacturing, retail, and agricultural inputs and machinery. In 2023, agriculture, food, and related industries contributed about $1.5 trillion to the U.S. economy, accounting for about 5.6% of total GDP. U.S. farmers and ranchers depend heavily on trade, with agricultural exports reaching $176 billion in calendar year 2024. 1 of every 4 acres of U.S. farms is planted to meet the demand of customers overseas. And that's why we believe we need more trade, not less. As the U.S. looks to strengthen our trading relationships, from the U.S. Chamber's perspective, the best pro-growth response to foreign trade barriers is to negotiate enforceable trade agreements that eliminate tariffs and other trade barriers and guarantee reciprocity. High-standard trade agreements help open foreign markets and level the playing fields. And we've seen the results of this. Well, we have 20 countries that are U.S. FTA partners. They represent about 6% of the world's population, but have regularly purchased nearly half of U.S. exports. And as we've already heard from Juan and Candace, in North America, we've also seen the benefits in terms of the tremendous growth of our trade and economic integration. And one of my colleagues likes to say it goes back even more than 30 years to 50 years with the U.S.-Canada Auto Pact and then the U.S.-Canada Trade Agreement, followed, of course, by NAFTA and USMCA. Mexico and Canada are the United States' 2 top trading partners across the board: goods and services, important markets for manufacturing, for top markets for small and medium enterprises, and of course for agricultural exports as well. Last year, Mexico became the top market for U.S. agricultural exports with a record $30.3 billion in U.S. exports, a 7% increase over 2023. And Canada was the second largest market with exports close to $28.9 billion. And as mentioned before, they're not only our top trading partners, but we make things together. And this applies across the board to manufacturing, but also to agriculture, whether it be, we focus a lot on the cars and auto parts that move across the border multiple times, but the same is true of a number of other products, the example of cattle being mentioned tariff-free free trade in agriculture has increased the efficiency of our cross-border supply chains. It's interesting to note that much of U.S. agricultural trade with Canada is intra-industry trade in terms of exporting products to one another in sectors like grain and feed, with dog and cat food being examples, mixes and doughs, and others. And as Juan mentioned, in the case of Mexico, our bilateral trade is largely complementary and provides the opportunity for year-round fresh fruits and vegetables, but also beverages and, of course, distilled services, distilled spirits of a unique nature, which can also provide us an important service, especially in today's challenging times. So it's a new twist on our agricultural trade.
Important service.
Yes. And finally, it's also important to highlight the role of investment. Both Canada and Mexico are important sources of foreign direct investment in the U.S. food industry, supporting jobs, exports, and research and development here in the United States. At the end of 2023, Canada was the second largest source of FDI in the U.S. food industry, with a stock of about close to $11 billion. And Mexico wasn't all that far behind, with a cumulative position of $6.3 billion in the U.S. food industry in 2023. And likewise, U.S. foreign direct investment contributes to our regional competitiveness. In 2023, Canada was the fourth largest destination for U.S. direct investment in the food industry, and Mexico was sixth. So to close here, we need to continue to build our strong partnership that has benefited our three countries so greatly. And we also have the potential to meet, as Joe mentioned, not just self-sufficiency in North America, but to meet the growing global demand. By 2050, world demand for food is expected to increase anywhere from 70 to 100%. So together we can do more to meet global challenges like food security, but energy security, and a whole host of other important issues. So with that, we're back to the, I look forward to the discussion.
Well, thanks very much. We have about a half hour, and I'd like to have a few questions with the panelists first, and then we'll go to Q&As. Again, if you have questions, remember the QR code up here if you're in the room, or put them in the chat online. But let me start with just you've all mentioned the benefits of this agreement, and I think that we're all on that team. But you know, we for the most part, up until the last couple of days, have had a largely tariff-free environment, where we've seen all these tariffs that, you know, almost no trade at one point in some products, now a robust trade that I'm sure you'll talk about a bit. But I'd like to get back to Candace. You had mentioned also the efficiencies that you see in the supply chain. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. Well, since you mentioned the auto sector, I'll just start there, but then I'm going to get back to your example in your opening remarks, Joseph. But the auto sector is interesting because I think people still assume, as we've had so much discussion on it, that you have production that's like the Henry Ford days, like a whole car is made in one place. And I think that's just not well understood. That those days are long, long gone. So with the long-standing trade agreement and tariff-free environment, we've allowed for the opportunity to get efficiency in our supply chains, which means, right, as we seek, it's actually more expensive to do something in whole at one place. I'm going to focus on the very part of it that I'm best at, and I can optimize that operation. So I think you were talking about cattle. I mean, cattle or pigs. I'm going to talk about pigs because my family raises pigs. I know enough to go have a conversation with someone if they want to talk about, and they say, I raise pigs. I'm like, oh, do you do weanlings? Do you do feeders? Do you do processing, or like, final product? You say slaughtering, I say processing. So, but it's a valid question because this doesn't all happen in one place. And the amount of like weanlings that are sent out of Manitoba into the US is incredible. So I'm taking a break from row cropping, but you take any commodity or any input or any food item, and now all of a sudden it's a huge shock. That which we've built these supply chains around now in decades, you're just going to add, number one, add all these costs on to the production, which has been so optimized, but you're actually underpinning like the long-standing trust and agreement, and you hit on it, where the investment is made in even more production and optimization. And now that's going to suffer as well. So it's just the decades long, which I think is so sad to see that threatened and potentially unwound, because it's not just about initial costs. This is about long-term heavy costs in what has been long in the making to optimize and put us in a good position competitively, productivity-wise and quality, and you touched on it innovation-wise as well.
Yeah, and to add to it, I guess those hogs are eating a lot of corn that comes across the border their way. So
all connected.
Yeah, it's amazing. Yes. Anything to add?
Well, I mean, I think we've seen, as mentioned, really the benefits. USMCA incorporated, a lot of new provisions that make it, a trade agreement for the 21st century in terms of agricultural, biotech, continuing to expand market access. And we are so closely integrated, as we saw during COVID and other points, just the potential disruptions to the supply chain. One component can make a really huge difference in terms of the ability of say one manufacturer or producer to continue to operate. And we're seeing this now a bit in terms of suppliers of parts that may be having some cash flow issues now as a result of tariffs that then may not be able to supply the parts needed in, say, here in the US or in another country. So there's multiple sort of unintended consequences of disrupting the supply chains that have been so efficient.
Yeah, and we know full well from COVID how critical that is. Juan Carlo?
Yes, if I could step in, I think it's an excellent opportunity now to see how we can do things better. I think, when you start this sort of process, there's always that window of opportunity that we can strengthen the relationship between the three countries of North America, especially in regarding to ag and food, and how do we make that relationship much deeper and more integrated. And that obviously is going to give us more efficiencies. And I think that review is an opportunity to raise these challenges and explore what efficiency solutions we can put into the table. First of all, I think science-based regulations are the best way to boost innovation in agriculture and trade disputes moving forward. I think we can all agree on this point, and under the principles of USMCA, it has been proven highly efficient mechanism to solve these sort of trade disputes. But I also want to put on the table other measures that we need to explore, like phytosanitary measures that, the three countries need to work together to better align the different standards of perishable goods through agreements and different sorts, but that's one big aspect. Number two, I want to mention labeling requirements. Some progress has been made in standardizing labeling practices between the three countries, but if we can move forward into this, we can ensure more transparency for consumers across borders. And there's another point, which is quality regulations. If we do a collaborative effort aiming to streamline certification process for agricultural products between the three countries, that can be also a lot of help. And of course, there are certain aspects of the relationship that give us certain challenges that we need to work through, but I think there has to be a full mutual recognition of standards, and that remains incomplete so far, leading to certain delays or additional costs to the whole supply chain. And I do think that in terms of regulatory frameworks among the three countries, if we have differences in this aspect, that's going to create bottlenecks and obviously hinder seamless trade, which we all want. So again, I think this is a fantastic opportunity under this review on how we can make things better.
Thanks, Juan. And that does, I think you're raising a very important point here, and that is this whole regulatory environment and framework that has developed, through the negotiations. And in fact, USMCA, I think a lot of people would say that those were, although, we often tend to look at the tariff levels and say, well, not much change. But in fact, you can make a good argument how modernized the USMCA was. Can you guys talk about that a little bit, about the regulatory frameworks? I don't know. You want to go first?
Sure. And I'll say just a couple things. I think actually there's been so much good work on the regulatory front. The Canadian Food Inspection Agency, signing a joint letter with the FDA saying, we kind of recognize, how we need to move forward. And I think it's very important, and Juan Carlos mentioned it, it's not harmonized, it's mutual recognition in a lot of cases. But there's been a ton of coordination, and the RCC has helped. I think we get caught up on it, and it's really frustrating. I think there's, you look at some bumps along the way, whether it's Canada's labeling requirements that we missed, unintended consequences there, and have to reroute. So there's not agitations or irritants. But all to say, my general point is, it's actually on that front probably a lot easier for Canada, US, and Mexico to tackle the regulatory aspect of a trade agreement than any of us with other markets, where it can actually be a lot more challenging, right? Because I think we have a good foundation, have done a lot of the heavy lifting and a lot of good work. Not to say there's not always bumps and a lot of work ahead, but I actually am pretty bullish or feel pretty satisfied with the progress and what I see, us keeping our sights set on and working towards.
Yeah, I would agree that in terms of, really strengthening regulatory cooperation and food safety standards, labeling requirements, again, providing those clear rules of the road can help minimize trade frictions. We've talked about the benefits in terms of specialization and the nature of our agricultural trade. But I think it also, addressing regulatory issues also helps, the three countries achieve economies of scale and increase productivity. And certainly, it's also worth noting that the agreement itself has created a number of committees and institutions that provide this space to address irritants or to share information. The Committee on Agricultural Trade, there's a committee on biotech, there's, of course, the dispute settlement. So all of these institutions that are created with USMCA provide the opportunities for governments to share information when there is a new regulation that's, whether it be labeling or a food safety issue, allows the governments to share information. And so we think really we should take advantage of these, especially as we look ahead to the USMCA review. There's existing mechanisms, right, to address our outstanding irritants and to work more closely to strengthen cooperation.
Yeah, I think when I was very young and just starting trade negotiations and things like that, I remember a lot of the disputes in the early days of NAFTA, and I made some comment to an older trade negotiator and said something like, geez, still having all these disputes. He said, no, that's really a sign of a healthy trading relationship because we have the mechanisms to take care of it. And yeah, sure enough. Okay, so we have a little bit more time before we go to the Q&As with the audience, but we do have a renegotiation or a relook at the USMCA agreement, and maybe one of you might want to talk about what exactly that is and what it entails. But what are the issues that are likely to come up? And I want everyone to sort of address that. Anne, why don't I start with you? Can you talk a little about exactly what we're looking at in 2026?
Sure. Well, I think we like to call it a review.
Yes. Yeah.
Before preempting and thinking about a renegotiation. But the review, the agreement provides for the three countries to come together and do a review 6 years after the entry into force of the USMCA. So we're looking at July 2026. Now, that process may move up, we've seen, and that's an opportunity for all three governments to provide recommendations in terms of issues that they'd like to address and to address those. And it's also an opportunity to confirm that they intend to, renew the agreement for another 16 years. And so there's in the USMCA implementing legislation in the United States requires USTR to carry out a public consultation before approximately the latest potential date would be October of 2025. And we've seen in President Trump's America First trade policy memorandum, a call for USTR to begin that process.
Okay, great.
Sooner
Sorry to
rather
put you on
than
the
later.
spot to give you
that's
the
fine.
rundown. That was
Yeah,
great.
Yeah, I think, in conversations I've had, we seem to say, and I agree 100%, it's supposed to be a review at the 6-year mark of a 16-year-long agreement. It's not supposed to open up renegotiation. It's like a check-in. But I think we bifurcate these things too much, a review and a renegotiation. If we open up the whole agreement, I think that's like absolutely risky and detrimental potentially to everything that has been well and long established now. But we could see it's a review, but an agreement to just open up certain chapters where the irritants are most deeply rooted. Like that could be a scenario, right? So we're just scenario planning. So when I look at, okay, what are to your question, the issues or I'm going to call them irritants because we don't have huge issues in relative terms when you look at, some of the other challenges more broadly globally in FTAs. We have a list of irritants. They're actually well outlined in the most recently published Foreign Trade Barriers report. It's 5 pages on Canada. It starts with their supply managed sectors and cheese and, 300% tariffs on cheese. So I'll just talk a little bit about that. We have not tariffed any dairy imports to Canada from the US. We haven't even come close to the US meeting quotas, which were negotiated in 2018, the USMCA. Massive gains for the US market negotiated at that point. And then I think, from Canada, we look at it, well, what's good for one has to be good for the other. There are protective measures in US in dairy, in sugar that, we would point to as well. And so I think for looking at what would come out in terms of the irritants, as I would call them, not big issues. But that's a discussion to be had around the agreement. And like last time in 2018, those discussions led to a real hard look and a change in quotas and access to markets that, like as I said, has not been even come close to yet at this point. So I think that's important in the discussion. But we've certainly heard a lot I think what the Trump administration has expressed in terms of our supply management in Canada.
Great. Juan?
Yes, Joseph, go along the lines of what Candace was talking about. And I do think that first we need to preserve what we have. As I said in the beginning, there's a lot that we have advanced over the last 30 years. Now, having said that, how we strengthen what we already have. And I agree with Candace, in ag and food, there are certain irritants. There's not that really big issues. But I'm sure there's some things that crop out of the woodwork when we start this review process, as they always do. And I'm afraid, for example, on tariff rate quotas, as was said, if we do any adjustments to that, that might impact market access for certain products like dairy or poultry that we need to be careful about. Number two, I'm sure that the seasonal safeguards are going to become part of the discussion too. And potential changes there could also affect pricing stability for certain produce and products in the US that we need to be careful about. In food, in processed food, we need to be careful with rules of origin because that might increase compliance costs for industry. And obviously, as I said earlier, in sanitary and phytosanitary measures, we need enhanced cooperation. And that is definitely going to improve efficiency, but it might necessitate significant regulatory changes in some of our countries. And I would go back to what I said earlier, that we need to promote a coordinated agricultural policy between North America. And that's going to definitely strengthen regional food security, which I think it's a plus for everyone. And it's going to maintain our competitiveness vis-a-vis other regions globally. And I think at the end of the day, that's what we need to achieve.
Great, thanks so much. I think the strong message of a review is a good thing, renegotiation, a very risky thing. Let's go to, we're at about time, we have about 10 more minutes, so let me, again, get those questions in. Use the QR code if you're in the room, and if you're online, send them in on the Q&A function. But do I have someone who is actually collecting those things? Oh, right there you are, thank you. Good, Ruby.
I have a few. So the first one is, free trade, it's a critical component of food security in the region. How can we ensure that agriculture and food are not used as bargaining chips in USMCA negotiations?
Anyone like to take that?
Well, if I may start.
Sure.
I think the crux of the matter is that we need to realize that food and ag is in a different space. We need to understand how important in this changing world food security is and how complementary in nature our sector is between the three countries. So I do think that we shouldn't be an issue in this review process. What we should be doing is how we can strengthen the relationship, how we can make it better moving forward, because I think it's a significant asset in North America, what we have in our sector in ag and food, and it shouldn't be touched because it doesn't have anything to do with other sectors and other discussions.
Thank you.
I would add.
Oh, please.
I think it's a good question. I think it in another way, just the question is, how do we see the role of food and agriculture in USMCA? But to the question directly, like potentially used as a lever, I think I would share that it is a real conversation when you look in the recent tariff activity, that it's understood and it is talked about that when you're looking at tariffs in this sector, and specifically with inputs like fertilizer that help grow food, there is this that's in a humanitarian kind of bucket, and it is looked at that way, and I think that's important. But the second thing is I do get kind of hopeful and optimistic about the role of food and agriculture and USMCA, because I think it's actually less about, and this was just mentioned, but I'll say it again, I think it's less about, what are the impacts or threats on food and agriculture if MCA doesn't continue? And I flip that script. I actually think the strengths we have and rely on a day-to-day basis in food and ag because of USMCA, it actually might hold this whole thing together. And I have my own experiences just out of the first Trump administration, where I think, how agriculture, the role it played in the whole discussion, it was so significant. And so I look at it with that sort of script flipped in terms of, I think we have such an important strength to rely on and are such an important positive aspect that can actually help steward through the next whatever version of our discussions around USMCA will be.
I think that's a very good point. And I would add, if we look at some of the core elements of food security, like affordability, availability, and food safety, we can point to ways that USMCA helps strengthen all of those.
Great.
So.
Ruby?
And since we are on the questions on USMCA, this is a question for each of you from your own perspective. What objectives in food and agriculture does your country have for the review of USMCA?
Who'd like to start with that? Juan, do you?
Well, I
Please.
can take a crack at it. I think we've spoken about it, or how we can strengthen and deepen the relationship that we have. And in that sense, I think there's a lot of things we can do. And our objective from our point of view in Mexico is that, obviously, as I said, how can we use more and more science and technology to move us forward in decision-making, in policy decisions within the three countries? How we can make this ag and food trade between the three countries more seamless, more for the opportunity to be there, not only for large growers, but also for small growers and medium-sized companies in the three countries. I think there's a bunch of things we can do to enhance the food security that we have in all of the three countries. And in the regulatory segment of the thing, we've mentioned several things that can be improved. And I think we should take the advantage right now that we're going to do this review process on how we can better all of those issues.
Great. How about the Canadian perspective?
Well, it's not a term we often use in the food and ag sector, but we use it in the energy sector, like how to be energy dominant. Like, I think we should be in the North American bloc, like food security dominant. Like we have so many advancements in, ag tech, and, there is this challenge you mentioned about, how to ensure global food security, because the story is still there. There's no more arable land. And this is something that we have a right to win at, because we're that good at it. And I think, just to flip from upside to downside for a moment, I think heading into, our next discussions on USMCA, it's like, why would we jeopardize that? Why would you want to lose the quality, the competitiveness, the productivity, the innovation, and the quality in our commercial union that we have built for the food and ag sector?
Well, I would say from the U.S. business community's perspective, certainly we want to continue to preserve and strengthen USMCA. I mentioned, and you highlighted, the NTE report. I mean, there are outstanding irritants, but I think there's mechanisms to address those issues, whether it be outstanding issues regarding dairy. We've had the decision on GMO corn in Mexico in terms of allowing the imports of GMO corn, but there's a constitutional reform moving forward in terms of planting GMO corn. So I think, issues like that or issues related to pesticides or labeling, there's a place and a form to address those and continue to strengthen the trade that we do using science-based decision-making to support strengthening our regulations. And really, again, tapping into the competitiveness, as Candace said, and really taking that and leveraging the potential to grow and meet global challenges for food security.
Yeah, no, thanks. Do we have time for one more, Ruby?
I think we should have time for one more and then close.
Yep.
This is a very specific one, and it's about what, can you expand on what phytosanitary regulations harmonization would look like? And is this an issue specific or is it across the board?
I didn't quite catch that, but I think it's for Juan Carlos.
Speaking about harmonization, regulating phytosanitary regulations. And I think Juan Carlos, you've mentioned like.
Well, I think we,
and what that would look like.
I think we need to align standards along the three countries. And that's going to make us have more seamless trade between the three. And of course, in quality and different issues, I think it's important that the three countries work on that, because that's going to help give us predictability on how things need to be done. And it's going to enhance food security in the three countries for consumers, which I think is very positive.
Okay, I think with that, we're going to close. Let me thank Juan. Thank you so much. And both Candace and Ann, thank you. This was really good, and we're around. So afterwards, if you want to chat, or at least we're around. One, you'll have to go to Mexico.
We'll text him.
Thanks so much.